is found in the book of Proverbs. Found in the book of Proverbs, the 24th chapter. I'm going to be reading verses 3 and 4. Proverbs 24, verses 3 and 4. Are you there? Through wisdom is a house built, and by understanding is established. It is established. And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. The Lord have blessing to the reading of His word. Amen. Amen.
Happy Reformation Day, everyone. This is Reformation Day. 503rd anniversary of it. And also the physical birthday of our brother Dave and the spiritual birthday of our sister April. So it's a nice time on Reformation Day. Back, I think it was in 1995, I was considering going to seminary. God had spoken to me at my baptism at the Wellington Seventh-day Adventist Church, basically a few days before. And the question was, when would I go? And I wanted to check out Andrews. I had never been there before. I mean, I had been baptized maybe 5 months previously. So I talked with one of the head of recruitment there, and he said, "Well, come, we'd love to meet you and that." And so I was there. And how many of you have physically been at Andrews? Okay, about 65%. And if you've been there, it's a beautiful manicured place, isn't it? At least when I was there, it's flowers and everything, and you have Pioneer Memorial. And opposite from Pioneer Memorial, if you're standing on the steps, you look, and what do you see directly across from you? The library, right? The library. You have all kinds of buildings inside the seminary where I went. And so when I got there, I wanted to check out the library. I went to the seminary and I looked at it, I thought, the library, it's the James White Library. Oh, isn't that sweet? They gave the husband of Ellen White a little library to name after him. I mean, you see, I hadn't been in, I didn't know a whole lot. I'm going, well, that's a nice gesture. Because I knew about Ellen White, but I'm going, that's sweet. Isn't that nice? Poor James, he got a library named after him. Not knowing there's a reason the library at one of our major Adventist institutions is named after James White. In fact, the library was dedicated on October 24th, 1962. Oh my goodness, this occurred to me. That was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm sorry, it's all the old historian coming through. I'm going, okay, maybe a good time to dedicate a library. But I soon found out in my study of Adventist history that James White matters. He matters greatly to our church. He's more than merely the husband of Ellen White. In fact, James White, you could argue, more than any other individual, was the architect of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As John read in Proverbs, by wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. And so in my sermon, I'm going to show how James White is more than the husband of God's messenger. That one of the things we need to remember 150 years later, when James White was alive, Ellen White was known as James White's wife. And it was after his death and her going to Australia that then the Ellen White we know of the primary position in the church changed, and James White, his ascendancy kind of dropped a bit. So who was he? Well, his most recent biographer, Gerald Wheeler, summarized James White as a man of startling contradictions, with great strengths and great faults. You find that with most people. You have great strengths, you have great faults. He was born on August 4th, 1821, in Palmyra, Maine. And in April of 1843, when he was all 21 years old, he was ordained a minister of the Christian Connection Church. You won't find him in the yellow pages, folks. Don't try looking for him. But the Christian Connection Church. It's interesting. What were the key beliefs of the Christian Connection Church that the young 21-year-old James White was ordained to? And you can see where some of those ideas and some of those doctrines and beliefs came into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The first point of the Christian Connection Church is the Bible is the sole authority. They were opposed to any set of creeds. C-R-E-E-D, like a creed. They were opposed. And because of that, they had a suspicion toward any type of church organization beyond the local congregation. And third, that truth was progressive. They were open to new light. And that's very key because that idea is enshrined in the preamble to the Seventh-day Adventist Church's statement of fundamental beliefs. We will not be closed off to new light if the Spirit leads someone. On Sunday, August 30th, 1846, James White, at the age of 25, married Ellen Harmon, who was 18. And they were married in Portland, Maine, by a justice of the peace in a civil ceremony. James was more than 6 feet at a time when most men were my height. And Ellen, well, she wasn't 6 feet. Does anyone guess how tall Ellen was? Say it, Nancy. 5'2". 5 foot 2 inches. Yes. So kind of like Muff and Jeff. James White observed many years later, and I'm sure there was a marriage on Tuesday. Mark and April's son Noah married Calista Nichols of Hillsborough. And I'm sure they won't write this, what James White wrote about what they were like when they were married. I just wanted to share that. He wrote, and this is many years later, that they entered married life, quote, penniless, with few friends, and broken in health. Wow, that's a great way to begin a marriage. No money, no friends, and bad health. That's from James White, his life sketches. Almost 2 years after their marriage, so this would be in 1829, James described to some friends who were the Hastings family about their destitute state. Quote, all that we have, including clothes, bedding, and household furniture, we have with us in a 3-foot trunk, and that is but half full. We have nothing else to do but to serve God and to go where God opens the way for us. Their health may have been broken. They may have been penniless, few friends. They only have their whole possessions only fill up half of a 3-foot trunk. But they said, we are going to serve God. And we'll go wherever he wants us to go. And then this is something to remember. This was April 27th, 1848. And in 1848, remember, this is 4 years after the Great Disappointment. So you have a small band of what were known as kind of Sabbatarian followers. Very few that came out of the Great Disappointment, and the Whites are a part of this. You have the Whites, you have Joseph Bates, and you have a young man by the name of Uriah Smith, who's also, along with Hiram Edson. And for about, from 1848 to 1850, you had something known as the Sabbath Sanctuary Conferences, where they would meet, they would study Scripture, they would pray about it, and then they would say, we believe this. And sometimes after the Bible study, the young Ellen White might receive a message, a vision to say, yes, this is the correct way to go. But the doctrines were built on Bible study and prayer, and then the young Ellen Harmon White would basically say, yes, confirm where they were going. In November 1848, at the Dorchester, Massachusetts conference, Ellen received a vision, and this is dealing with church practice. This is where Ellen White would lead out in her vision. Ellen received a vision that James must start a periodical to disseminate the doctrinal understandings developing among this little group of Sabbath-observing Adventists. They're studying this. They're building the truth on the Sabbath, the sleep of the dead, the sanctuary truth, the second coming, spiritual gifts. And so she receives a vision that they must start a periodical. And so in the summer of 1849, while living in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, James White produced the first Sabbatarian Adventist periodical. It was called The Present Truth. James was able to get 1,000 copies printed on credit at a Middletown, Connecticut printer. And at Rocky Hill, the small group of believers folded and addressed the magazines and then prayed for God's blessing on the new periodical. And then James put the 1,000 copies in a carpet bag and walked the 8 miles back to the Middletown post office to mail them. Why is that important? Because more than any other event in our church's history, the publication of a paper, soon to be called the Review and Herald, helped to create a sense of community among the isolated believers and to lay the foundation for the soon creation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And if you look at the early Review and Heralds, and I was able to do that at the James White Library, there in the seminary section, you will get letters. They would come to people during the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. And I copied down one because this kind of reflects what many said. Quote, "There are no Sabbath keepers here. I'm by myself and just my companion. We feel very lonely, and I know not what we should do without the review." It meant you were a part of something. You know, there might not be any Sabbatarians around from 100 miles. But the review, in many ways, was your church. And you would read about, let's say Elder Paris gets the review. He has maybe a little group of 4 or 5. Their church would actually be in their house. And the sermon would be an article they would read from the review, written by James White or Joseph Bates or J.N. Andrews. These are very dense biblical articles. If you read them, so they would read that. And then when they were done, Elder Paris might go to the post office, or if he knows someone going that way, and he would make sure Sister Adams has that same periodical, so they can get together for church in 2 weeks. Well, they will read that article. That will be their sermon. And they'll read through the whole paper. That was church. That was church really from those early days from 1848 to about 1860. And so it brought a sense of community. The Review and Herald became the main channel of communication for the scattered believers. You read the old ones, there will be notices there. Rochester, Minnesota. We are going to have a meeting 3 weeks at Elder Derwinger's house. And so you would see these. It was like a post office. And so, or basically, Mrs. Abbott is not feeling well. Can someone give some health principles to her? Does anyone else? You basically read of these people. They're out on the frontier. They're all alone, but they have the Review and Herald. And that is where you have the community. It would announce meetings and would provide news of the slowly emerging church. In fact, Proverbs 22, verse 28, this is something that was very big in the Review and Herald. They would put this text right up at the masthead. Do not move the ancient boundary which your fathers have set. Those ancient truths they had learned from the Bible. I mean, if you look at it, it is, and if you go back now, you can just go on your computer and just type in. Okay, what was going on in December 1854? And it'll come up. And you will see notices from people. You will see news of the church, and you'll have these very long, scholarly, biblical articles written by lay people, but they were very learned. And so James White wrote many articles on the emerging doctrines of the early church. Him, J.N. Loughborough, Joseph Bates, Uriah Smith, and a great scholar among them, the young J.N. Andrews, who knew both Hebrew and Greek. And you get these very scholarly articles. For the rest of his life, the publishing work, along with church organization administration, would always be at the center of James White's life. In fact, 25 years after the publication of The Present Truth, in 1874, James White founded the second church periodical, Signs of the Times. Do you know where it was published at? Oakland, California. He organized the Pacific Press, that was James White, to produce Signs, and he had the second publishing house to the Review and Herald publishing house. So you had the one in Battle Creek, and now you have a second publishing house, the Pacific Press, out in California. Now the key transition for this young couple, if you notice, you can tell they didn't have much money. They're moving around all the time. They might stay with some friends for a month in Maine. Then they go to Connecticut. Then they kind of go around. In 1852, the Whites left Connecticut in the spring, and Ray's not here, for Rochester, New York, where our brother Ray's doing his studies. And this is really the first time in their life that they remained somewhere for more than a year or a year and a half. They lived in Rochester for 3.5 years. And in Rochester, James established the first known Adventist Sabbath school. So there's a trivia point for you. When was the first Adventist Sabbath school established? By James White in Rochester, New York. And then many of us know where they went in November 1855. They made the move to Battle Creek, Michigan. And they did it as a family of 5. James was 34. Ellen was 27. Henry was 8. Edson was 6. And Willie was 1. For the next 48 years, Battle Creek would serve as the headquarters for the church. Have any of you been to the village, the Battle Creek village, the historic village here in Battle Creek? Okay. You can go to the actual house on Wood Street where Mrs. White received the Great Controversy vision up in an attic. And it's very powerful. It's Heidi and I have been there a couple times. So one of the key things on being the architect of the church, he was the main driver of the periodical work. The other thing he was as the organizer of the church. And we need to remember, he came from the Christian connection where they are very, very worried about any type of organization. Any type. And we need to remember, many of the people who followed the Great Disappointment, like the Harmon family, were disfellowshipped from their churches. So the idea of organization is going to be a big mental hurdle and emotional hurdle for many of them. There was fear among many Sabbatarian Adventists that the church would become spiritual Babylon if they should organize beyond the congregational level. You know, they would be, of course, they read in Revelation 14:8 about Babylon. Another angel, a second one follows, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality." In fact, in the Adventist Review, they talk about this little group, I think it was in Michigan. They built a little church. The church might be about as big as this platform. Maybe as big as, so you might have 3 pews, maybe for 10 to 12 people. Maybe a little lectern for whoever the speaker was. And they said, you know, one of these people came in, they looked at this little shed, basically, and said, Babylon, I'm out of here. You know, and that is the way the thinking there. Anything, even a building with pews in it, you know, we're becoming Babylon now. Now you might say, where they met? They would meet in people's houses. They had house churches. So this is what the whites were going to have to overcome. And they needed organization in handling the following issues. Legal incorporation of the Review and Herald Publishing House. That's how that came about. The state of Michigan basically said, you need a name to be a legal entity to run that publishing house. So in October 1861, the corporation's name was Seventh-day Adventist Publishing Association. So they had to be organized to be incorporated, to have incorporation articles for the state of Michigan. The other thing they needed organization for is that if you just have isolated groups of believers, you could have someone come in and say, well, hey, I'm a student of the work, and then go and preach, you know, some false messages and destroy everything. So false wolves and imposters were usurping Sabbatarian pulpits. And so by 1855, an identification card was given to recognize speakers and ordination of local elders, deacons, and pastors. You would have that card. So if you're in Ohio, I could go from Middletown, I could go up to Bowling Green, and they'd say, okay, Elder Lake, you say, can we see your card? And Mark could produce the card. Okay, here's the pulpit. And so that was one way to try and bring some sort of organization to it, because you don't want people coming in and preaching false doctrines. So, and as a result of that, in 1860, you had the first plan of systematic benevolence, pay for those in ministry. Those who would, because remember, you didn't have enough pastors. You did not at that time. So an elder or a deacon, that's why you would have cards. You would be the lay pastor. You would go there. And for systematic benevolence to function, you needed an organizational level above the individual congregational level. And so you had the formation of state conferences, beginning with the Michigan Conference in 1861. The first president, does anyone know the first president of the Michigan Conference in 1861? Joseph Bates. First president, and the clerk was Uriah Smith. Of course, they were all based in Battle Creek. On May 23rd, 1863, you had the formation of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Ohio was one of the conferences, Minnesota was one of the conferences, Michigan was one of the conferences. And from that, you set up a General Conference. And James White envisioned the General Conference as an umbrella organization for the growing number of state conferences. And if you've been to Battle Creek, the quote General Conference, where the little building was maybe a third of this. Again, you'd have, basically just kind of pews, and you'd have maybe 3 or 4. That was the General Conference then, in 1863. In fact, there were 19 delegates comprising the newly formed General Conference, and they unanimously elected James White as president. He declined because he didn't want it said, well, there are the Whites again, James and Ellen, usurping power, and that. James White said, thank you, but no thank you. So they chose a man from Massachusetts, John Byington, as the first General Conference president. However, beginning in 1865, James White would serve 10 years as president, though not consecutive years. Excepting for the formation of Signs of the Times in 1874, most of James White's path-breaking work for the church was completed by 1865. Since 1849, when he had become the publisher of the periodical soon to be named the Review and Herald, and had assumed leadership of the Sabbatarian Adventist movement from Joseph Bates, he had been the architect in forming the organized Seventh-day Adventist church. However, his ministry and James and Ellen White's life changed on August 15th, 1865, where James White suffered a major stroke due to overwork, the first of at least 5 that would haunt him until his death 16 years later on August 6, 1881, at the age of 61. After this major stroke, and it should have killed him in that time, he survived, and if you remember, for about 5 months, from September, or about 4 months, from September through December 1865, James and Ellen and their family stayed at Dr. James Jackson's water cure treatment sanitarium, known as Our Home on the Hillside, in Dansville, New York, so that he could rebuild his health. And so for 4 months, they were gone from Battle Creek. A huge leadership void there. Merritt Kellogg wrote to Ellen White in 1872 about James's deteriorating health. Quote, I am grieved to learn that Brother White is so poorly. He has worked himself down and must have rest. Do come immediately to California and rest. Brother W. must cease brain labor for a time. I suppose he feels that he must work, and that the cause will suffer if he does not work. But if he works himself into the grave, then we will have to get along without him. And so, if you remember, one of the main reasons for the health reform message from Ellen White was because her husband was working himself to death, was not taking time off, not taking rest, and these early leaders, these guys had put in 80-hour weeks, and many of them didn't even make it to 61. And that was one of the key reasons for her health message, know when to rest. And James White, his great strength was he was a driven man. He was a driven man, and the strokes affected him physically, mentally, and emotionally. It's not written about enough, And Ellen White never really talked about it, but others said those final 16 years, James is very difficult to live with. You know, if you know someone who's had strokes or is driven, there could be some rough times. But they stayed together. They loved each other. While James White realized that others needed to assume the tremendous burden of leadership that he had been carrying for over 25 years, his dogmatic personality prevented him from voluntarily stepping aside and allowing others to take over the work. And one thing you need to remember, one of the reasons James didn't want to kind of go out of the limelight, he was the main defender of his wife. And we need to remember, in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s, a large group in our church rejected Ellen White's ministry and said all she is doing is piggybacking on James White. I mean, and remember I said she was known as Mrs. White, James White's husband. He was the defender. It was his job to have the criticism fall on him so that Ellen could do her ministry to the side. But it took a great toll on him. But he still went forward. On August 6, 1881, 2 days past his 61st birthday, James White passed away at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. The funeral was held at the Dime Tabernacle on August 13, 1881, and it was the largest funeral then ever held in Battle Creek. Over 2,500 people in attendance. Today that doesn't sound like much. That would be like you have a funeral and 150,000 attended. It was, it showed that this man was more than Ellen White's husband. He was the architect. He was the indispensable man. I mean, Joseph Bates lived into his 80s. He died, I believe, in 1874. You still had Ellen White. You still had G.I. Butler. You still had Loughborough, who lived into his hundreds. Uriah Smith was still around, but the architect was gone. And one of the things, remember, he died in 1881. 7 years later was 1888. And one of the interesting things, I did a paper on seminary for Dr. Domstick's class. I said, I want to do a paper on the dissenters of the 1888 message. And which was very interesting, because in many ways they were the majority. They hated Wagner and Jones and that, these were some upstart snot-nosed kids. And you get these letters from G.I. Butler and from Uriah Smith, people who knew James White. And they wrote this to Ellen. And they'd say, if only James were here, he'd take care of these young whippersnappers. Oh, he would roar, he would, And so you can kind of see reading this, that they needed James White back to knock these young whippersnappers, Wagner and Jones, put them aside. I mean, letter after letter. Oh, if only he was around. And I think they were criticizing Mrs. White, saying, why aren't you doing this? But it tells you something. It's like one of the things, oh, if only he were here. Oh, if only he were here. Uriah Smith gave the eulogy for James White, his good friend. And he quotes, as left by him, his work bears the marks of a wise builder. The elements of stability and permanence are wrought into all the structure. God buries the workman, but still carries on the work. His influence will still be felt. The impress of his shaping hand will still be seen. And all the future workings of this cause will revive and keep alive his memory. Unquote. And that's true. Even more than the library at Andrews. This building, the sign that says who we are, our periodicals, our structure. James White's hand is foundational in that. And those of you who been to Andrews, about 2/3 of you, How many of you went out to Oak Hill Cemetery, also in Battle Creek? Okay. And saw, first off, you get to see the little grave of Uriah Smith, some others, and then you come to the White family gravesite, where James and Ellen are buried together, along with their 4 children. 2 lived, 2 passed away, and they're all there together. I think of James White when Paul wrote this in 2 Timothy 2:15. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. James White, husband, father, theologian, builder, architect, man of God. May God remember him at the resurrection of the righteous, when he and Ellen and Edson and Willie and Henry, they will all be raised together. Our closing hymn is number, is it 445, Nancy?